I am, thank you, the director of IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. We are an independent charitable research institute working to strengthen the voluntary sector through research, education, and training. And a lot of our work is with, for, and about funders, because on the top three lists of things that make life hardest for charities and funded organizations is the funding experience. And I am going to talk. So in terms of the style of the session, this is presentation plus Q&A. I'm joined by my colleague Sonakshi, senior researcher at IVAR.
Thanks, Ben.
And Sonakshi is jointly leading the work looking at the application of the open and trusting grant making initiative into public agency funding. And although the research I'm going to draw on today is largely based on work with trusts and foundations, we are interested in the read across into the domain of public agency funding. And so do pick that up in the chat. Please post questions in the chat as we go. Hopefully we can pick those up and actually we'll monitor them. If we don't get to them, we will endeavor to answer them as soon as possible after the session. And I'm hoping that in the chat, we can, albeit within the constraints of a huge group, have more of a conversation. So do please share your own experiences of how you think about and approach and operationalize risk in your practice as we go through. So I'm now going to share my screen and I'm going to talk for probably 20 or 25. So if you want to turn your camera off and make tea while you're listening, that will be fine. I won't be offended. But then we'll come back into the room and see if we can generate something useful in the conversation. So, all good?
Yes, we can see the slides. Thanks, Ben.
Marvelous. Thank you. When you get a bus pass, as I recently do, you are indulged a little bit more, I realize, in terms of problems with technology. So thank you, Sonakshi, for that. So here we are. And I want to just provide a bit of context for the conversation about thinking about risk in funding. And that context is the work of the Open Trusting Grant Making Initiative, which some people today are part of, and sharing your experience would be very welcome as we go through. So what is open and trusting grant making? It comes from the embracing of more flexible and light touch and trusting practices that we saw through the pandemic. And it's captured in this slide, the idea of a simpler, more respectful and more inclusive philanthropy. And to operationalize that commitment, open and trusting funders sign up to these 8 commitments, which really cover the arc of the funding experience from pre-application stage, don't waste time, through to the flexibility of funding, enable flexibility, commitment 6, and right up to reporting being proportionate. And so if you think about the arc of the experience, both from an applicant and a funder, open and trusting grant making is trying to shift each stage of that. And we are obviously today concerned with commitment 3, accept risk. So when you sign up to open and trusting grant making, and this is important to understand, that this is not just about signing up to a pledge, although actually the work of London funders with the pledge through the pandemic provided fantastic momentum into this more formal commitment. you adopt the 8 commitments, you share what you're doing to put them in practice. So if you go onto our website and click on the name of a funder who signed up, and there are now 135 trusts and foundations of all sizes and shapes across the UK, responsible for around £1 billion worth of grant making into the voluntary sector annually, you have to tell people how you're trying to bring those commitments to life through your practice. You join a community of practice of other funders, and I'm going to draw on some of the conversations we've been having with the community of practice about risk in today's presentation. And you're held to account for your progress through a peer review that takes place every 2 years, which is facilitated by charities. And you can read all about that on our website. The spirit of open and trusting, and it's important that this frames our conversation today, is that each funder faces different constraints and different opportunities. And today we will have endowed family foundations through intermediary funders onto local authorities. So context matters. There's no single way to be open and trusting. And so there are multiple entry points, but everyone can go further. And that really does come through the work of the initiative of the last 3 years, is that wherever you are on the spectrum towards being more progressive, towards shifting more power to applicants and funded organizations, no one has yet got this right. There's no silver bullet, and everyone can go further. And they are trying to go further, open and trusting funders, because of this view that by working towards shared goals and by making the most use of precious resources on both sides, that will lead to greater impact. This isn't just about funders fixing their practices, although clearly a lot of change is in the gift of funders, but this is about trying to bring patience and empathy to a shared endeavor to do things differently and to do things better. And key to open and trusting grant making, and I want to acknowledge, there are other movements around philanthropy in the UK with whom we collaborate, who are entering the conversation about change in different ways and at different points. But open and trusting grant making, and the clues in the title, it wants to take seriously this point that how you fund is as important as what you fund. So let's get on to our topic, risk. And let's start by sharing some of the findings from the evidence review that we've been carrying out and that will be published next week, and that we'll be sharing with you when that happens. So the evidence review is built around commitment 3 of open and trusting grant making, which says we funders will accept our share of risk. We will be realistic about how much assurance applicants can reasonably give us. You can really see how that's come out of the pandemic, when all of those commitments to outcomes were thrown up in the air because of lockdown. When we will clearly explain how we assess risk when we make our funding decisions. Now, I've been involved in this work for a very long time, and my organization benefits enormously from the work of funders, and I feel passionate about the open and trusting movement. But I've got to say, we don't clearly explain how we assess risk when we make our funding decisions at the moment. It's very hard, if you search on funders' websites, to find anything that really tells me as an applicant or funded organizations how you're understanding and treating risk. And yet, as I'm going to talk about this morning, we see risk lurking in the shadows of decision-making about what to fund and how to fund. So we are trying to bring it out into the open through this work. And why does it matter? Well, if we think about foundations, we can say, I think, that the freedom of independent foundations to take risks is noted and often celebrated as a vital and distinctive contribution to social action. But we also see that funders desire to embrace what we might call good risk can easily become mired in confusion and anxiety. And the research evidence suggests, as the slide says, that without a greater understanding of what funding risk looks like to us as a funder and who carries it, the funder or the funded organization, many efforts to mitigate it are misdirected, and therefore much of the social value of risk-taking, which is in the gift of funders, are unrealized. And so, as the quote says, that without taking those steps to identify, understand, and manage it, that ability to play a risk-taking role is severely limited. And so we see a tension already, because we see the enormous potential that comes from being able to take risks, and we see that potential being thwarted because it's not being named and understood, and therefore I think we see people defaulting to risk aversion. If we then think about risk in funding, we immediately encounter this problem identified by our friends and colleagues at Trust-Based Philanthropy Project in the US, that a lot of the concepts come from a different sector, and they're rooted, if you like, in a different paradigm, which is about protecting the money, protecting the institution, and that just doesn't translate easily. And this is a problem because the models that are available, and this reminds me of earlier work that we did around mergers, where a lot of the thinking around merger came from the business sector and were really about profit margins and didn't really pay adequate attention to the emotional factors that often drive voluntary action. And we see the same problem here of importing concepts from other sectors. Now, this doesn't mean, as the quote says, and we would support this, that you shouldn't think about the risks involved, but don't just import the models from industries that are not in the business of providing for the public good. Because providing for the public good is different. So, the starting point for this conversation that we're having today and ongoing are these 4 points. Firstly, risk is multidimensional. Let's think about the concerns that funders express when they talk about risk. People talk about fraud. Whenever we do a session about this, we ask people to put their hands up about how many instances of fraud there have been in the last 5 years. And the answer is not many hands going up. And yet that often drives practice. People are concerned about waste of funds if organizations close, or grants not delivering intended outcomes, or actions that by funded organizations that may damage the funder's reputation, or just not learning from grants when funding innovation or untested work. So it's multidimensional. Secondly, risk is inherent in any grant or project or enterprise. There's no venture that is free of the risk of something getting in the way. So the challenge actually here is working out which of our judgments about risk are what we might say objective, so based on evidence or even facts, if we accept that facts still exist, and which are subjective, which are rooted in feelings and opinions. And we've got to come up with some way to separate the subjective side of risk, what we might call our bias or our comfort, from the objective reality that the world is unpredictable, so we can then decide how to deal with unpredictability in order to do good with the money. And although, as we're going to talk about, the context of being a foundation or local authority is different, a public agency is still wanting to do good with that money for local communities, local neighborhoods, thinking about health and well-being of a local community. But the reality is that the world is unpredictable. Thirdly, we think about that, pulling those two concepts apart isn't a straightforward process. But if you don't make a clear distinction between what the evidence is describing as objective and subjective risk, then problems occur. Primarily, that the process of identifying and managing risk becomes driven as much by untested assumptions and judgments as it is by a careful consideration of what could go wrong and how likely that is to happen. And the consequences of this, so the consequences of not making a distinction between objective and subjective risk and surfacing that and naming it, the consequences are evident in many funders' perceptions of certain groups of charities, and most notably Black-led organisations and racial justice organisations, an assumption that they are inherently riskier, despite a lack of evidence to support that view. So we've got to say, when we use the word risk, it means lots of different things. And in large part, those things are implicit biases. And if we don't try and surface that and test those assumptions, we're falling into a trap there and into what has been quite standard practice, I think, in the sector. And then finally, this notion is that the charities carrying a disproportionate burden of risk in the way that they're funded. If you look at the research that we've been carrying out through Open and Trusting on applications, on reporting, on multi-year funding, and most recently on funding for Black-led organisations and racial justice work, we see the constraints of, short-term restricted funding on charities, and that hampering their ability to do their best work. So this work around trying to bring risk out of the shadows is partly about trying to generate energy and opportunity, rather than being stuck with a model inhibits us in going further. So let's just register the distinct types of risks that the literature tells us funders experience or think they experience: financial, reputational, governance, impact. And clearly, as we'll see as we go through the conversation, it's not just one, and they are not self-contained. Clearly, they are interlinked. But actually, if you really dig into what risk means to you and why, it's likely that you're going to have most of your preoccupations in one of those four blobs. And then we see six key aspects of risk in funding from the evidence. And these are really important for, I think, developing a slightly different mental model about risk. And this is part of the effort to try and, as I keep saying, bring risk out of the shadows and into conversations and into the flow of our working, moving away from assumptions towards intentionality. So firstly, risk events are highly variable. They can occur anywhere, anytime. Some may be predictable or not. Some may be controllable or not. And some may be caused by internal variables and some by external variables. So risk is highly variable. Secondly, it's relative, not absolute. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that risk sits on a spectrum. So identical events may be deemed more or less risky based on the viewpoint of the funder. So if I think back to when I was on the UK Grants Committee at Comic Relief, public reputation was a huge concern there. So a small £10,000 grant to a really fantastically interesting organisation doing important work was rejected by the trustees, and we were up in arms in the committee because we could see the value on it, but because of the reputational risk, because the Daily Mail was interested in putting Comic Relief on the front page. That wouldn't have been an issue in an endowed family foundation. And if you look at Barra Cadbury Trust, whom we've done a lot of work, most recently around their work on funding for systems change, you see some pieces of projects funded there that lots of other funders wouldn't touch with a barge pole. But because funding those is an expression of their values and their roots, and they have that freedom to act in that way. So it's really important to understand your identity in relation to risk, and we'll come on to how you might do that in a minute. Thirdly, and this feels to me increasingly important given the operating environment into which your funding is going at the moment, that risk can lead to reward. So labeling something as a risk, I think, implies the possibility of a negative effect, but actually taking that risk can be a positive, intentional choice. And I was struck in a session we were running last week by a funder talking about trying to move their funding from low risk, low reward towards high risk, high reward. And if you think about funding into complexity, which a lot of you will be doing, funding in intractable, enduring social challenges, rethinking risk feels very important there at the moment, not least because of the precarious nature of life as a small charity trying to do that work. Fourthly, for funders, risk culture is a matter of choice. So we're talking here about an organization's appetite or tolerance for taking risk. And it's largely in your gift. Now, for local authority colleagues today, the constraints are distinctive and different. But I think we would argue that whatever the nature of your constraints are, there is still an element of choice about how much risk you attach to a grant and how much risk you might take on yourself through freeing up organizations in the way that you fund them. Fifthly, risk management is a matter of practice. So in other words, in grant making, risk management practices are the steps that both funders and funding organizations can take to reduce the likelihood of a harmful event or the harmful consequence to the event. So you can do something about it. And finally, and absolutely crucially, and this is the drumbeat of today, I think, the risk cannot be avoided. There's no such thing as zero risk. So let's move towards the conversation by just reflecting on what's come out of the open and trusting community of practice in discussions about how to try and move forward with that commitment of accepting more risk. And the starting point for that conversation was this quote from Amy at Pears Foundation. And it's the second part, really, that we want to think about today and in the next half hour or so. Our starting point should be the risk of the money not supporting the difference we want to make. And within open and trusting, a question that is increasingly being used to frame the whole design of grant making is, what will it take for this work to go well? And if we think about the operating environment of organizations who are applying to you for funding or receiving funding currently, I'm not convinced that the answer to what will it take for this work to go well would be, for example, a 12-month grant with prescribed outcomes to do work of any degree of complexity. But that is the risk-averse funding, and that is the dominant model, despite the efforts, I'm sure, of many of you to be shifting towards greater flexibility. That remains, I think, the dominant experience of charities. So the 4 actions to help funders accept more risk. Let's rattle through these. Firstly, and this picks up from the evidence, you'll see, the importance of a shared understanding of risk. Now, for some funders, that is, I know, and I think some people here today may speak about that if they want to, have used earlier work we carried out here, which I'll share in a minute, to produce a risk framework that basically allows you to try and be really explicit internally about where you sit on the spectrum of risk, which risks matter to you, and how that then translates into practice. And that helps push forward a shared understanding of risk at all levels. But at all levels is crucial. Alignment really matters here, because I think what we see is that in the absence of clear signals from trustees or local authority members about risk appetite, the danger is that the grant-making process defaults to risk aversion and the unspoken anxiety about trustees' tolerance for risk. So if we can name that tolerance for risk, we can then align operations with that. So that is, there's real value there in pushing assumptions. And I think a key starting point for that conversation about shared understanding is the recognition that actually people can really struggle to say what risk really is. And I love this quote from a colleague in the community of practice, is what's most important is an acceptance that the term risk can be used interchangeably with discomfort, unknowing, stress. That's often what is really driving risk practice. Second action is linked to that, and is this value of being explicit about risk. And if we think about what that's going to mean in terms of being more transparent, it's going to be important to think carefully about language. Is there a better way to frame risk so communities understand it better? Because actually, it may not be the best word to be using. Attention also needs to be paid to understanding the multidimensional nature of it, because the reality is that for many of you, your risk tolerance may vary according to what you're funding and who you're funding. And that differentiation is going to be important to articulate. But risk being talked about and named rather than implied and invisible feels like a really core feature of being more open and trusting. Because when it remains invisible and implied, you are holding on to the power around risk there as a funder. And I, as an applicant or funded organization, am back in the second guessing space. And open and trusting is trying to move us out of that space. The third action I mentioned already is the need for differentiated approaches. And we need to acknowledge that for an intermediary funder, for example, and indeed a local authority, the room for maneuver there is going to be different. And actually within that, there's going to be differentiation in terms of how you're funding and what you're funding. And risk tolerance will vary there. For others, it's going to be possible to go much further because of what their context allows them to do. And therefore, being more intentional with experimentation, for example, is going to be possible. So understanding where you sit there and what your constraints are is crucial. And then finally, is this point about valuing, of managing risk through relationships. By having direct conversations and visits, by being exposed to the work and the experiences of funded organizations, you are able to understand better that environment and therefore understand better the factors that both can create but also reduce risk. And that agile and open way of working really does help with the management of risk. But this quote is really important, and we're going to end on this, that we're all in the risk business when we're making grants, even the most risk averse organizations. Once you make that grant, you've taken a risk, and you need to recognize that. There's no such thing as zero risk. It's just how you manage it. And just to end, this is the framework we developed just before the pandemic, and which a small group of funders, some of whom I think may be here today, are going to be working on with us over the summer to update. But it encourages funders to think about risk in relation to these 7 dimensions. And we'll share the link to this. And then what you're doing is thinking about where you sit along this spectrum. So certainty and clarity of outcome, comfort with emergence, the need for certainty, and financial risk, being a first funder, organizations with low reserves, a requirement for financial stability. And then, and this is how we're developing the tool to think about how that develops and moves into practice. What is the practice that is, if you like, the manifestation of that risk appetite? So again, I've talked about alignment of people, trustees, grant staff, funded organizations and applicants, but also the alignment of process here, attitude and appetite to risk, translating into practice. And I think that's absolutely crucial, because if there's a disconnect there, or if there isn't a transparency around that, that's where problems begin to occur. And there we have it. Okay. Thank you. So
it's a time for any questions. If you want to share here or in the chat. There's a comment from Nicola in the chat around grant applications. The reality, yeah. Do you want to come in, Nicola, and share your thoughts on the comment that you put in the chat?
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm from the National Lottery Community Fund. Yes. And about 5 years ago, we went to a relationship way of working, and just sort of agree with what was put on the slide in terms of actually going out to meet groups face to face, talk to them, see the activity in motion. It just really, really makes a massive difference. It's more human, it's more relatable. And I think, and then again, if English is not the first language, or can't put themselves over so well on paper, just actually seeing that and having a chat, or providing different ways to actually come across about what the project is or what you want to do. The other thing is then it's about thinking, okay, what actually can you do? Do they need some more development support? What else can you build into that? Have a more honest relationship, and kind of having that and breaking those barriers down to make a massive difference, rather than kind of just looking like a piece of paper. So that's really helpful. And also having the honest conversation up front, saying, I'm not sure you're quite ready for this, or have you looked at this, or have you worked on that? It's really, really helpful. It's just that human touch. So that's been really refreshing. I head up the region for the Midlands, and that's what makes me come into work every day, actually, those kind of the staff out there, going out there. And I think for me, the applications that we see, it's kind of someone's idea and best guess. It's what might happen in 5 years' time. And I kind of very much see that as a starting point and an outline. It's not a work of fiction so much, but, you know, after going through the pandemic, going through no cost of living, it's a best guess. But actually, I'm more concerned about what impact are you going to make, who else can you work with, what could you do, how could you make this stronger, what's the best thing for your organisation, rather than some of the other factors that come into it. So yeah, I think I kind of agree with that. It would just be, but again, I think the visibility of that and the honesty of that, because I think people may have a bad experience with a funder and they'll never forget that, and then they won't return, even though you may change. They're kind of saying, well, that's it now. I've got limited resources. I haven't got that time. And the power dynamic that, you know, they won't return. So it's always worth knowing that. And you have to go the extra mile. You have to go further. You have to put yourself out there in order to look for the groups and win back trust, really.
Thank you, Nicola.
Milka, do you want to come in?
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to find where to put myself on screen, but never mind. Hi, I'm from Clarion Housing Association, Clarion Futures. I'm just wanting to comment. Thank you. That was really, really helpful. And we're looking at risk at the moment and audit. And we tend to be quite flexible funders. One of the things is, as you say, about risk appetite and reducing risk and understanding that it's not possible to eliminate it. One of the things that we thought is quite useful when you are working maybe with a new partner, and we do work with lots of grassroots organisations that are small, because they're rooted in our communities. Just one thing we're sort of sharing really is the idea somehow of staging the funding where it's practical. So it's enough to get the project off the ground, but again, visiting, seeing how it's going. So giving the funding in stages so that you are managing the risk to a degree when it's a very new project and you're enabling the project to get off the ground. But it means that, you know, if the project changes or something happens, you've got that flexibility, that you've got some of the money aside so that you can somehow mitigate that. So that's just one of the things that, you know, we're looking at exploring more you know, during funding. So just, yeah, something I thought I'd sort of put out there, share. Thanks.
I'm interested to hear from people who have found it difficult maybe to take more risks or have encountered blockages internally, if they've got any reflections on that, or conversely, what has enabled you to take a bit more risk to achieve a bit more flexibility. If there are colleagues who've got experiences on either side of that, it'd be helpful to hear. Rebecca.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't find my hands up. Just to share our experiences, I mean, it's definitely still a journey for us, but we had a session a couple of years ago with our board and actually used the spectrums that you showed on your slide, which were really helpful actually for the conversation. The board trustees went off in groups and discussed where they thought we sat and as a board in terms of our approach to risk and our appetite for risk. And it was very interesting because they didn't actually have a common view on it, and it really exposed how differently they all felt. And some of them felt that actually, no, we're really open to risk, this is how we make grants, in this way, and then others were saying completely differently, that we weren't open to risk in that way. And that was really helpful to have had that conversation. And also it kind of gave us the vocabulary to talk through with them about when we're making a risk. So when we're taking a grant to them and we're articulating these risks a bit clearer, having had that conversation made that easier. And also I found that now when we talk about these risks, actually they seem a little bit less risk averse than before, for naming it, saying that this is the potential, this is the risk, this is how likely we think it is. And actually, I think having had those conversations and talking about it a little bit more has made them a little bit more open to thinking about what that worst case and thinking actually that's not that bad. You know, I'm open to that potential of happening, especially in terms of the proportions. If we think about how many grants we're making and how many of them actually are risky, then actually they look at the proportion and think, oh, you know, we can make those quite risky grants, because on balance, that's quite a few in our portfolio. So that's been a helpful process. But definitely, there's still more conversations I think that we need to be having about it.
Really interesting. I mean, it echoes a lot of what we've covered, doesn't it, in terms of the benefit of surfacing and naming. Just before we go on to Eleanor and then Sarah, have you seen a difference in practice flowing from that? I mean, so has it kind of flowed through to operations?
Yeah, definitely a difference in practice in terms of how we as a team are talking about risks in our assessments. And it's been received that we know that we've had that baseline conversation with them. So, but definitely we're talking about risk and thinking about what type of risk it is in the assessments a little bit more than we used to.
Interesting. Thank you. And before we go, I mean, what's interesting, you know, you give unrestricted funding, you know, you might be characterized externally as a funder that is comfortable with risk. So it's interesting how even in a funder that is comfortable with unrestricted funding, it wasn't a conversation, it wasn't something that was being talked about explicitly.
No, and actually, I mean, they've always given unrestricted grants. So I think we're starting from a kind of different kind of baseline. They're very comfortable with giving unrestricted grants. But then I think the risks are a bit different because, of course, we're investing in the core of this organization, and so there's kind of an expectation that we think that they're well run and they're delivering good impact. And so, you know, yeah, there's different kind of, I suppose it's a different kind of risk. They're not looking at the objectives of that particular amount of money, but we are looking at whether we think this is a good organization and doing good work.
Yeah.
And I was thinking when you talked about the different types of risk where we kind of sat, and I think financial risk is definitely something that was always talked about. It was a way of controlling like where the money went, but now we've got a lot more kind of parts of our assessment are covering off those and managing that risk a lot more. So I think there's a lot less anxiety around that because we understand the organization's finances in the way we didn't before. But I do think it's the impact thing. It's thinking about grants and systemic change and policy work, which we want to be funding, but we can't measure. It's not as tangible, that kind of impact. And I think that's the area that we're going to need to focus on a little bit more and be comfortable with making grants where the impact is less tangible. And that's, I think, where we need to be focusing a little bit more going forwards.
Really interesting. Just later in the year, we're publishing some work around different ways of assessing the impact of unrestricted funding.
That's very helpful for us.
But reveal the need for a high degree of comfort with emergence and uncertainty. So
yeah, it's balancing that with being light touch as well. We really want to be light touch. So it's kind of, yeah, it's getting that balance for us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Should we go to Eleanor?
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct because I'm aware of time. But yeah, so we, as a London Marathon Foundation, report to trustees. There's a structure. There's obvious. I mean, the analogies to the comic relief about reputational risk stand with us, not heavily, because we are the charity that own London Marathon and the events, but obviously they are interlinked. I think we have taken risks. We've moved away from purely funding capital, which the pandemic was a big influence on our changing direction and wanting to support and engage with the sector more recognizing that actually the way to do that was really through revenue funding. So we fund both capital and revenue. So there are kind of obvious kind of heavier risks on one element than the other, really. And I guess for me, it's kind of that yes, we do take a certain degree of risk, but as an officer who is in charge of a funding program that's making decisions, you know, it's a line I struggle to kind of navigate just in terms of decision making. And you know, we found that a peer review process has really helped that, because it kind of opens you up to other views and opinions within your team, and working through that. But nonetheless, I think you know, it is sometimes tricky kind of balancing the way in which decisions or recommendations are presented to trustee viewpoints, you know, and working with the trustees. We have a grants committee, we have a kind of higher board of trustees, etc. It's a path that I kind of struggle to kind of navigate sometimes. I think particularly yeah, I mean, just kind of our experience of kind of managing capital, particularly over the past few years, where you've seen costs rise in construction terms and building firms go out bust, etc. So there are all sorts of continuous processes of risk that are kind of managed over a number of years, really, on initiatives. We're probably one of the few sort of capital funders around funding sports buildings and equipment, etc. So yeah, so I guess that's just kind of what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Eleanor. I think it's interesting what Nicola said about trying to make the process more human, and I think that brings into play a greater acknowledgement around uncertainty, unpredictability, volatility. And I'm thinking back to some work we've done in a separate forum, the Evaluation Roundtable, around this idea of trust-based learning, but also just trying to break this sort of performative nature of funding, where, you know, applicants overclaim and then grant managers polish and present to boards, and at each level of the process you're moving further away from the reality, which is it's messy, it's guesswork, it's a bet. Applicants are really asking for the amount of money they think you'll give them, not what they need. And actually that process needs to become more human, and part of that is about what Rebecca was saying, I think, about surfacing and naming risk and actually having that conversation about it in a way that is framed by, you know, empathy rather than something different. Thank you. Sarah.
Thanks, Ben. This is fascinating. So many thanks for everything you and others have said already. Your point about the sort of objective and subjective evidence around risk, I guess, or approach to risk is really interesting. In my time working in this sector, it feels like there has always been a narrative of funders worried about the risk of grantees, charities, whoever, becoming reliant on them. And that has got in the way of multi-year funding, for example. And I mean, I have a sort of a personal point of view that, you know, that is the whole nature of this sector, right? Funders give out money. And so really, aren't you just passing the risk on to other funders in the sector? Let's just pass around the risk. But anyway, my main point to be, I think, is around what I'm trying to do now is bring in objective evidence, of which there is so much, you know, some from IVAR and many others across the country and the world, around, you know, the fact that multi-year funding actually gives organisations a better chance of being more resilient, more financially capable, and so on, and trying to sort of introduce that into the conversations that we're having internally as an objective piece of evidence to challenge this assumption that I see so often, that the worry of organisations becoming reliant on us or other funders. So it's just something that I'm trying to introduce a bit more as we go through.
Really, really interesting. And yes, we can maybe put in the chat the research we published recently around multi-year funding, which is called Time to End the Dominance of Short-Term Grants. And yes, I mean, I'm always at risk of straying from being a researcher when I try and speak calmly about the problems of multi-year funding, because I think that the assumptions behind not giving more than 12 months are so deeply flawed. And the idea that you can assess someone as being suitable for your funding for 12 months but not 24 months it feels a little untested, shall we say. But a risk lurks in the shadows of that, and that's why I think it is partly about the mindset, but it's also this starting point. What will it take for this work to go well, rather than how can we protect our money? So that's very helpful. Thank you, Sarah. Oliver, good to see you.
Cheers for that. I have a couple of questions. I'm not quite sure if it's like a tight mechanical question or an expansive chin stroking one, but it's so where, like, legally speaking, where does the responsibility of the funder end and the job of the regulator begin when it comes to risk? And sort of relatedly, and this is where I tip my hand a little bit, as a foundation that's closing down. Are you aware of, or have you seen foundations using forms of like donation and gift that have no obligations as regards monitoring and compliance attached to them whatsoever? In the same way, if I personally make a donation to Comic Relief, it doesn't entitle me to monitor that donation as far as I'm aware. And if I leave a gift to cancer research in my will, I can't monitor that from beyond the grave. So it's something about what we actually have to do legally, and the assumptions and the responsibilities that we're taking on unnecessarily. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know me, and so you know that I'm not going to be able to answer the regulator question that coherently. We'll take that away. I think that I think more philosophically, if you think about unrestricted funding, the way I would understand it is that you're gifting the money, but also the power and the choice to me as a funded organization, firstly, to determine how I allocate those resources within my context, which are the obligations I have as a charity to the regulator. So, I remember, because as I receive those funds, I will have to account for those funds, both in terms of the audit, but also in terms of public benefit. I, as IVAR, because in terms of VAT on research, so there's a context there. What I don't know is whether, as a funder, you have to require any kind of reporting formally to you. Now, we have negotiated with our core funders an arrangement whereby we provide our annual report on our accounts. And the grant we got to set up IVAR from Tudor Trust in 2000, I found the letter recently, and it said, and this is 21 years before we launched open trusting grant making, our preference is that grantees decide how to report on their work, because it's their work. And so we chose to report because I believe in accountability, but we didn't do a bespoke report. So I don't, in theory, that is available to you as an arrangement between yourself as a funder and a funded organization. The terms and conditions you attach to it are largely in your gift, because once it's in my bank account, my system of accountability kicks in.
Yeah.
And that's one of the arguments I think that we're making around unrestricted funding. You know, we are monitoring anyway because we have to, but also because we're interested in trying to do good work. We don't just engage in learning activities as a charity because you tell us to. We do it because we're trying to do the best we can do. So part of this is about, yes, Oliver, you're right, thinking about actually what freedoms do exist around that transaction, but it is also about mindset. It's actually not thinking charities are trying to rip us off here. It's actually the vast majority of people are trying to do the best they can do on both sides of the relationship. Sorry, Oliver, I think I'm going to go.
No, it's all good. Cheers.
On, and then we should finish. Sorry, we better be quick.
Just a quick one, really. Yeah, this has all been like really super interesting. I think something that I've been considering, like I work for London Marathon Foundation as well, and just in terms of like managing risks and kind of how to kind of approach that through like that human element, and kind of thinking about like how we develop relationships with like grantees. And I think one thing I've been considering at the moment, and something that I'm like struggling with, is like how do you marry that with the capacity and marry that with the effects on like the quality that you're delivering.
Yeah, sorry, the background noise, but I think I heard you. I think one of the risks around the whole debate about relational funding as distinct from transactional, and the risk of that being a polarity, is suddenly funders are panicking about, you know, needing to visit everyone all the time, but also funded organizations are thinking, oh Christ, here there's a queue around the block of people. Not every grant requires intense, regular interaction. So I think relational, it is better understood as human. It's Nicola's point. And actually, some people, it really, grant, delivery, chat once a year is absolutely fine. So I think it is about tailoring it. But remember, there's a great quote from Trevor Pears actually about thinking about risk is managing risk through relationships, not paperwork. You're repurposing time away from collecting lots of bespoke reports that you're going to do bugger all with into conversations, curiosity, and learning. So this isn't additional, it's instead of, but it is differentiated. I think we have to finish. Please send us questions. We're all on a journey. I know every bit of our life is a journey now, but we really are around open and trusting and trying to understand this. And it's only by talking about it can we find different ways of doing it. If you didn't have your question answered, please email it to us, unless it's about regulator, in which case Google it, because I won't be able to answer that one. We've put a link in the chat to a very exciting IVAR initiative being launched today, which is a podcast, which is obviously terrifying, but enjoy listening to it. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you London Funders for hosting us as always. This is a great festival, so I hope you're all going to lots of other events. And Grace, anything from you?
Just a huge thank you to you two for sharing that today. Really interesting discussions. Really looking forward to kind of seeing that report on risk come out and listening to your podcast. Please do head to the festival website. We've just popped it in the chat. We've got so many more sessions the rest of this week and next, and hope to see you at so many more. Thank you so much, everyone.
My email in the chat. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.